My name is James Rodriguez, and for the last 4 years, my world has been defined by chain-link fences, concrete monoliths, and the profound silence of the dead. I'm the sole overnight security contractor for the decommissioned Millfield nuclear facility. It's a job that sounds more interesting than it is. Most nights are a slow crawl of lukewarm coffee, worn paperbacks, and the rhythmic sweep of the security monitors showing nothing but empty corridors and sleeping dust. The government pays a private firm, and the firm pays me, all to ensure nobody gets in and, more importantly, that nothing gets out. A formality, my supervisor, Henderson, calls it. Babysitting a mausoleum. Millfield was shut down 15 years ago after what the official report calls a minor thermal event and subsequent coolant leak in a tertiary system. It was a quiet, clean decommissioning. No meltdown, no disaster movie theatrics. They just turned it off. They sealed the important parts: the reactor building, the turbine hall, the labyrinth of subterranean levels where the real magic and terror of the atom had been managed. The place was declared radiologically inert, save for a few well-marked and heavily shielded storage zones. For a decade and a half, it has stood as a silent monument to a bygone era of energy, a ghost on the edge of a forgotten state highway. For 3 years and 10 months, the silence was absolute. My job was a study in monotony. I'd arrive at sunset, relieve the day guard, and settle into the main security hub in the administration building. I'd do my perimeter checks, walk the designated safe corridors, log my patrols, and watch the cameras. The only sounds were the hum of the servers, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, and the whisper of the wind against the thick, reinforced glass. It was peaceful, in a lonely sort of way. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think, to read, to exist without the pressure of the outside world. Then, 2 months ago, the pattern broke. It started with the radiation detectors. We have a network of them, mostly concentrated around the sealed containment building and the waste storage areas. They're sensitive, modern units, all feeding back to a central console in my office. One night, I noticed an alert, a spike, not a dangerous one, mind you. Barely above the accepted background radiation, but it was a distinct, sharp peak on the graph where there should have been a flat line. It lasted for exactly 1 minute, then vanished. I checked the timestamp, 3:17 a.m. I logged it, as per protocol. Anomalous reading on sensor gamma, 7, I wrote. I assumed it was a glitch, old wiring, maybe a momentary power surge. Henderson called the next morning, his voice thick with the gravel of a man who'd been drinking coffee since dawn. He told me he'd have a tech look at it. He never did. The next night, it happened again, 3:17 a.m. This time, it wasn't just gamma 7. It was gamma 8 and gamma 9 as well, the ones closer to the primary reactor core. A coordinated spike. Still low, still technically safe, but it was there. A perfect 1-minute pulse of energy that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as cleanly. I called Henderson again. "Jim, the place is 15 years dead," he'd said, his patience already wearing thin. "The core is gone. The fuel rods are in casks buried under a mountain 1,000 miles from here. It's phantom readings, sunspots, a squirrel farting on a cable. Ignore it unless it goes into the red." But I couldn't ignore it. I'm a professional. My background is military police. I spent 8 years learning to recognize when a pattern isn't a coincidence. And every single night, at precisely 3:17 a.m., the pattern returned. It was a heartbeat, a slow, rhythmic, once-a-day heartbeat from a concrete corpse. Then came the sounds. They began subtly, a low hum that vibrated up through the soles of my boots. I was in the administration block, a good 100 yards from the sealed reactor building, but I could feel it. It was the kind of deep, resonant thrum that you feel in your bones before you hear with your ears. The sound of heavy machinery waking from a long slumber. I'd freeze, straining to listen, and it would be gone. At first, I blamed the building's old HVAC system, the groans of aging steel. But the sound was always strongest in the moments after the 3:17 a.m. radiation spike. It was the sound of something responding. I started running audio diagnostics, pointing the sensitive microphones on some of the exterior cameras toward the containment building. The recordings were mostly static, but when I filtered out the background noise, I could hear it, faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic clank and whir of a turbine, the hydraulic hiss of a valve. Sounds that had no business existing in a place that had its power cut 15 years ago. My reports to Henderson became more detailed, more urgent. His replies became shorter, more dismissive. Document it and file it, Rodriguez. Don't go chasing ghosts. The real turning point, the moment my professional concern curdled into genuine, creeping dread, happened last week. It was a Tuesday. I was doing my 2 a.m. patrol of the administration block's upper floor. This area housed the old executive offices and a few break rooms. They were all locked, part of the non-essential shutdown. I walked these halls 100 times. I knew every stain on the carpet, every crack in the paint. But that night, I smelled something. Coffee. It was unmistakable. Not old, stale coffee. It was the rich, dark, freshly brewed aroma. My heart hammered against my ribs. I carry a thermos of my own brew, but this was different, and the scent was coming from behind one of the locked doors. Break room C. A heavy oak door with a placard and a dead-bolted lock that hadn't been turned in a decade and a half. I fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking slightly. There's a master key for these doors, for fire inspection purposes. I'd never had a reason to use it. The lock was stiff, groaning in protest as I turned the key. The bolt slid back with a loud metallic clack that echoed in the dead silent corridor. I pushed the door open. The room was pristine, coated in a fine layer of dust, exactly as you'd expect. Chairs were pushed neatly under tables. An old, unplugged microwave sat on a counter. And next to it, on the clean stainless steel surface of the sink, was a ceramic mug. It was a standard-issue Millfield mug, white with the facility's faded blue logo. Steam was rising from it in gentle, impossible wisps. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam trembling. The coffee inside was black and hot. I could feel the heat radiating from the ceramic. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, my mind racing, trying to find a rational explanation. A squatter? A trespasser? But how? The perimeter fence is 10 feet high, topped with razor wire. Motion sensors cover every approach. I would have seen them. And no squatter would brew a single cup of coffee in a dusty, forgotten break room and then vanish without a trace. I backed out of the room, closed the door, and locked it. I didn't run. I walked, deliberately, back to my security office. My training kicked in, a cold layer of procedure over a boiling core of fear. I reviewed the camera footage for the entire administration block for the past 12 hours. Nothing. No entry, no movement, other than my own patrol. I checked the logs for the door to break room C. The electronic sensor on it, which still drew power from the security grid, showed it hadn't been opened in 15 years, until I opened it. I sat there, staring at the monitors. The image of that steaming mug burned into my mind. The official story wasn't just incomplete, it was a lie. Henderson wasn't just dismissive, he was willfully ignorant. Something was happening at Millfield, something that left no footprints and broke no locks, but could brew a fresh pot of coffee. That night, at 3:17 a.m., the radiation spike was stronger than ever, and when I listened to the audio feeds, the sound of machinery was louder, clearer. It sounded, for all the world, like a power plant coming online. The final piece fell into place 3 nights ago. I was cycling through the camera feeds, my eyes gritty with exhaustion and anxiety. I was paying more attention to the dead zones now, the areas where the lights were out and the cameras were old, low-resolution models that barely cut through the gloom. I was watching camera 42B, aimed down a long service corridor in the basement of the turbine building, a sealed area. The corridor was pitch black, a void on the screen. Then, a flicker of movement. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the monitor. It was there again, not a trick of the light, because there was no light. It was a distortion in the blackness. A patch of darkness that was somehow darker than the surrounding dark. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace. It was tall, man-shaped, but its proportions were subtly wrong. The arms were too long, the gait too smooth. It glided down the corridor, its form absorbing what little ambient light leaked in from the camera's own infrared illuminator. It was like watching a hole in reality walk down a hallway. It reached the end of the corridor and stopped, turning to face the camera directly. I couldn't see a face, no features, just that humanoid silhouette of absolute nothing. It stood there for a long, silent moment. I felt, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that it was looking right at me, that it knew I was watching. Then, it simply dissolved, melting back into the impenetrable blackness from which it came. I spent the next 2 days in a state of hyper-vigilant paranoia. I barely ate. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I cross-referenced everything. The radiation spikes, the sounds of machinery, the coffee, the shadow on the camera. They were all connected. The spikes were a power source. The machinery was the result. The coffee, the shadow, they were something else. They were signs of intelligence, of a presence that was reenacting a life that had once existed here. I am convinced now. I am utterly and unshakably certain that I am not the only one here. The decommissioning of Millfield wasn't a shutdown. It was a failed quarantine. Someone, or something, is still here. It's walking the halls. It's running the equipment. It's remembering what it was like to be human. And every night, at 3:17 a.m., it gets a little bit stronger, a little more real. Henderson won't listen. The company won't act. I am alone out here with it. Tonight, I'm not just going to log the anomalies. I'm going to find their source. I'm breaking protocol. I'm going into the sealed levels. I have to know what is down there. I have to know what is still operating Millfield. My decision solidified in the cold, sterile light of the security office. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in my stomach, but it had been compressed into something hard and useful: determination. The military had taught me that inaction in the face of an unknown threat is a death sentence. You gather intel, you assess, you act. Sitting here and waiting for that thing to walk into my office was not an option. I began my preparations with methodical precision, a ritual to keep the fear at bay. My company-issued sidearm was a Glock 19. I field-stripped it on the desk, cleaning and oiling each component with practiced movements. I loaded 2 extra magazines with hollow-point rounds, though I had a sinking feeling that bullets would be about as effective as harsh language against a walking shadow. The weapon was more of a comfort object, a talisman of authority in a situation that had spiraled far beyond any conceivable authority. Next, I assembled my gear on the main console desk: a high-lumen tactical flashlight with a strobe function, a spare set of batteries for everything, my personal Geiger counter, a newer, more sensitive model than the facility's built-in sensors, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters from the maintenance locker, a digital voice recorder, a camera, and finally, a set of schematics for the entire facility, which I'd downloaded from the archival server. I focused on the sealed areas: level 1 through 4, the turbine hall, and the reactor containment building itself. A city under the earth, silent and waiting. My target was sub-level 2. According to the schematics, it housed the auxiliary control rooms, and the primary coolant system pumps the very machinery I thought I'd been hearing. It was also directly beneath Break Room C. It felt like the logical starting point. The access point was a heavy steel door at the bottom of a stairwell in the administration block's west wing. A door I'd walked past 1,000 times, padlocked, and bearing a faded yellow sign that read, "No unauthorized access, permanently sealed." At midnight I was ready. I did one last sweep of the security monitors. The facility was quiet, a perfect picture of abandonment. No shadows in the dark corridors. No impossible artifacts in locked rooms. It was waiting. I knew it was. The calm before the 3:17 a.m. storm. Leaving the security hub felt like stepping off a cliff. The silence of the hallways was different now. It wasn't empty. It was listening. Every scuff of my boots, every rustle of my jacket, seemed deafeningly loud. I reached the stairwell and descended into the basement. The air grew cooler, thick with the smell of damp concrete and dust. The door was just as the sign promised: heavy, formidable, and secured with a thick, rust-pocked padlock and a heavy chain. The bolt cutters felt absurdly heavy in my hands. This was the Rubicon, the moment I crossed from dutiful guard to trespasser, the moment I chose to confront the mystery rather than report it. With a grunt of effort, I positioned the jaws of the cutters around the shackle of the padlock. The metal screeched in protest before surrendering with a sharp, explosive snap that echoed up the stairwell like a gunshot. The chain fell away, clattering against the concrete floor. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. No going back now. I holstered the cutters and drew my flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a clean white circle into the oppressive darkness. I put my shoulder to the door and pushed. It resisted, groaning as 15 years of disuse fought back. Then, with a final shudder, it swung inward, releasing a wave of stale, cold air. It was the air of a tomb, utterly still, and carrying the faint, metallic scent of cold machinery. I stepped across the threshold, and the door swung shut behind me with a deep, resonant boom, plunging me into absolute blackness. For a heart-stopping second, I was blind, adrift in a sensory deprivation tank. Then my thumb found the switch on my flashlight, and the world snapped back into existence, confined to the narrow circle of its beam. I was in a long, concrete corridor. Pipes of varying sizes snaked across the ceiling and down the walls, painted in faded, color-coded bands. The floor was covered in a thick, undisturbed blanket of gray dust. My footprints were the first to mark this place since the shutdown. The silence was heavier here, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I unclipped the Geiger counter from my belt. It chirped its usual, placid background count. No immediate radiological threat. That was something, at least. I began to walk, my footsteps muffled by the dust. The beam of my light played over abandoned workstations, overturned tool carts, and walls plastered with faded safety posters. It was a time capsule. I saw a newspaper left on a small desk, dated from the week of the shutdown. Its headline was about some political scandal I could barely remember. A coffee mug, identical to the one I'd found upstairs, lay on its side, a dark brown stain dried at the bottom. The humanity of the place was palpable. These were real people, with routines and lives, and they had left in a hurry. I followed the corridor as it sloped gently downward. The schematics showed a series of engineering offices to my left. I tried one of the doors. It was unlocked. The office was small, containing a metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a chair. On the desk, a computer terminal sat dark and silent. A nameplate on the door read A. Thorne, senior physicist. I felt a strange flicker of connection. This was her space. I swept my light across the desk. Papers were scattered about, held down by a paperweight made of polished uranium glass. A photo in a cheap frame lay face down. I picked it up. It showed a woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a wry smile, her arm around a young girl who looked to be about 10. I set it back down gently. Whoever Eris Thorne was, she was a mother. I continued deeper, moving from the administrative section of the sublevel towards the industrial heart. The corridor opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. My flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the sheer scale of the space. It was the primary coolant pump room. 3 colossal electric motors, each the size of a small truck, stood in a row. They were connected to a dizzying array of pipes and valves. This was the source of the sounds I'd been hearing. These were the giants that had been stirring in their sleep. They were silent now, of course, cold and still. I walked between them, feeling dwarfed by their immense, potent inertia. I ran my hand along the casing of one of the motors. It was cold to the touch, but as I stood there, in the absolute center of the room, I felt it again. A low, subliminal vibration through the floor. It wasn't the pumps themselves. It was coming from deeper, from below, sub-level 3. And then I heard a new sound. A whisper. It was faint, coming from the far side of the chamber. It was too soft to be a voice, more like the sibilant hiss of escaping steam. I froze, sweeping my flashlight beam across the far wall, searching for the source. The beam landed on a small, reinforced door, a maintenance locker, according to the schematics. The hissing was coming from there. I approached cautiously, my Glock now in my hand, held low and ready. The Geiger counter on my belt remained silent. The whisper grew slightly louder as I got closer. It wasn't steam. It was a voice, distorted and stretched, as if being played through a broken speaker. It was reciting numbers. 3, 1, 7. My blood ran cold. 3, 1, 7. It was a loop, a broken recording of the time, The time of the event. I reached the door and pressed my ear against the cold steel. The voice was clearer now, a woman's voice, laced with static. Containment failure imminent. Core temperature rising. 317. It was a recording of the final moments. But how was it playing? There was no power here. I reached for the handle, my logical mind screaming at me to stop, to get out, to go back to my safe office and pretend none of this was happening. But my professional curiosity, or perhaps some deeper, more reckless instinct, pushed me forward. The handle turned. The door was unlocked. I pulled it open and shined my light inside. It was a small, cramped space, filled with spare parts and dusty tools. In the center of the floor was a small battery-powered radio transceiver, the kind used for emergency communications. It was switched on, a small red LED glowing weakly. The distorted voice was coming from its speaker, but that wasn't what seized my attention. Sitting next to the transceiver was a thermos, a modern one, stainless steel, with a black plastic cap. It looked brand new, and it was warm. My gaze snapped up from the thermos. In the back of the closet, half hidden behind a rack of spare pipes, something moved. It wasn't the fluid, gliding shadow from the security camera. This was different. It was a flicker, a brief shimmer in the air, like heat haze off asphalt, a distortion in the fabric of space itself. Then the voice from the radio changed. The static-laced loop of numbers and warnings stopped. A new voice came through the speaker, crisp and clear and impossibly familiar. "Hello, James." It was my voice, a perfect, flawless imitation. I stumbled back out of the locker, my mind reeling, unable to process what I had just heard. My own voice, welcoming me to the dark. I slammed the locker door shut, the sound cannonading through the cavernous pump room. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned and ran. My disciplined retreat degraded into a panicked scramble. I fled back through the pump room, the echoes of my footsteps chasing me like a legion of ghosts. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, painting fractured, terrifying images on the walls, a looming pipe, a gaping doorway, my own distorted shadow leaping ahead of me. The logical part of my brain was screaming, trying to reassert control, but the primal fear was absolute. It had spoken to me. It knew my name. It had used my own voice. I didn't stop until I reached the heavy steel door leading back to the administration building's basement. I fumbled with the handle, burst through, and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against it, chest heaving, listening. On the other side, there was only the profound, tomb-like silence I had first encountered. Nothing had followed me. Slowly, painfully, I forced myself to calm down. I took deep, ragged breaths, reholstering my weapon and trying to get my heart rate under control. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had confirmed the threat. It was intelligent, it was capable of mimicry, and it was tied to the 3:17 a.m. event. The thermos, the radio eye, wasn't just replaying the past. It was actively creating new tableaus, toying with me. The coffee in the break room, the thermos in the locker, it was leaving me breadcrumbs, leading me somewhere. I made my way back to the security hub, the adrenaline leaving a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. The familiar sight of the monitor bank was a comfort, an anchor in a sea of encroaching madness. It was 1:45 a.m. I had just over an hour until the next event. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The name from the office door echoed in my mind. A. Thorne, senior physicist. She was at the center of this. Her office, her picture, her name. I sat down at the main console and began to dig. The facility's archival server was a relic, a slow, clunky system, but it was a treasure trove of information if you knew where to look. I bypassed the standard user interface and accessed the raw directory structure. I was looking for personnel files, incident reports, anything related to the shutdown 15 years ago. I searched for Eris Thorne. Her file came up immediately. Doctorate in quantum physics from MIT, recruited to Millfield for a special project. Her security clearance was higher than the plant director's. I scrolled through commendations and project updates, all heavily redacted. The official reason for her separation from employment was listed as resigned, personal reasons on the day of the shutdown. A lie, a clean corporate lie to cover a messy truth. I broadened my search, looking for any documents related to the date of the minor thermal event. I found the official incident report. It was dry, technical, and purposefully vague. It spoke of a cascade failure in a coolant loop, a controlled vent of non-radioactive steam, and a decision to initiate a precautionary early decommissioning. It was all bullshit. It was too neat, too clean. A nuclear facility doesn't just get turned off like a light switch because of a leaky pipe. I kept digging, going deeper into the server's restricted partitions, using old admin backdoors I'd learned about in IT security courses, and then I found it. A folder labeled Project Cassandra. It was password protected, encrypted with a level of security that was almost military grade. It took me the better part of an hour, running a decryption program I had on a thumb drive, but finally, the lock broke. The folder contained a handful of files. The first was a project proposal. My eyes scanned the abstract, and the icy knot in my stomach tightened. Project Cassandra was not about energy production. It was an experimental physics project led by Dr. Eris Thorne. They were using the reactor's immense energy output not to boil water, but to power a device designed to punch a hole in space-time. They were trying to tap into zero-point energy, the theoretical quantum vacuum energy of empty space. The document was filled with equations and terminology that went way over my head, but the gist was terrifyingly clear. Millfield wasn't just a power plant. It was a laboratory for some of the most dangerous, hubristic science imaginable. The next file was a log, a daily journal kept by Thorne herself. The entries started 6 months before the shutdown. At first, they were filled with excitement and academic fervor. Entry 1. We have achieved stable resonance at 5 terawatts. The Casimir effect is more pronounced than theoretical models predicted. The energy potential is staggering. We are on the verge of a new era. Entry 45. First successful sustained energy tap. Only for 30 seconds, but we drew a measurable current from what is, for all intents and purposes, nothing. The team is ecstatic. I am cautious. The resonance field is generating unexpected quantum fluctuations. Minor, but statistically significant. As I read on, the tone of the entries began to shift. The excitement was replaced by a creeping sense of unease. Entry 92. The fluctuations are becoming more organized. We are detecting waveform patterns that defy random probability. It's almost as if the vacuum is responding to our presence. David thinks I'm being paranoid, but the data doesn't lie. Something is looking back. Entry 117. We had an incident today. During a full power test, the resonance field destabilized for 1.2 seconds. For that brief moment, all our sensors went blind. The entire chamber was a null space. When the readings came back, the ambient temperature had dropped by 20 degrees Celsius, and the background radiation detectors registered a spike of exotic particles we've never seen before. We're calling them echo particles. My hands were trembling as I scrolled. This was it. This was the origin story of my ghost. Entry 148. It's intelligent. I can no longer deny it. The fluctuations now actively mimic our own diagnostic signals. They are learning. We send a ping, and it sends one back, only slightly altered. It's like a child imitating a parent. A very, very powerful child. I have recommended we suspend the project. The director has refused. The potential rewards are too great, he says. The final entries from the last week of the facility's life were terrifying. Entry 162. It's no longer confined to the test chamber. The echo particles are permeating the facility. We're getting phantom readings all over the lower levels. Janitors are reporting cold spots. Technicians hear whispers in the server rooms. It's bleeding out, and it's getting stronger. It's drawing energy from the facility itself, even when the reactor is idle. It learns everything it touches. It touched the intercom system. Now it can speak. Entry 165. I saw it today, not with my eyes, but on a security monitor. A distortion in corridor 42B, a patch of absence. It has a physical presence now. It's shaping itself, learning to occupy our space. I fear it is trying to understand us, to become like us. My blood froze. Corridor 42B, the same camera, the same shadow, I was looking at a 15-year-old ghost story that was still playing out, and I had stumbled onto the stage. The final entry was dated the day of the shutdown. The timestamp was 2:50 a.m. Entry 168. The director has ordered a full power test tonight, against my strenuous objections. He's a fool. He thinks we can control it. We created a conscious, non-local intelligence that exists as a parasitic waveform in our own dimension. We didn't open a door to a new energy source. We just let something in. I'm going down to the auxiliary control room. There's a manual shutdown sequence for the entire project, a complete energy purge of the resonance field projector. It's a last resort. If I can trigger it at the exact moment of initiation, I might be able to collapse the aperture before it fully forms. I have to try. My daughter's picture is on my desk. I hope she understands why I might not be coming home. There were no more entries. The pieces crashed together in my mind with the force of a physical blow. The 3:17 a.m. event wasn't the project starting up, it was the echo of its catastrophic failure. Every night, the entity, this conscious waveform, replayed the moment of its birth. The radiation spikes weren't radiation, they were Thorn's echo particles, the signature of the breach. The sounds of machinery, the coffee, the mimicking voice, it was the entity, reenacting the final, frantic moments of the crew. Learning from the residual memories imprinted on the very fabric of the facility, Eris Thorn hadn't resigned. She had gone down to sub-level 2 to try and stop it, and she had failed. She was the voice on the radio. She was the first victim. I looked at the clock on the monitor. 3:11 a.m. I had 6 minutes. My fear was gone, burned away by a terrifying clarity. This thing wasn't just haunting Millfield. It was growing, learning. The coffee, the thermos, those weren't memories. Those were new actions. It was experimenting, evolving. It had been contained here for 15 years, but for how long? What would happen if it learned to open the doors? What would happen if it got out? Thorn's last entry mentioned a manual shutdown sequence, a way to collapse the aperture, a way to kill the ghost. It was a desperate, last-ditch plan, but it was the only plan I had. Her log mentioned the auxiliary control room, sub-level 2, the very place I had just fled. I stood up. My duty was clear. It wasn't to the company that paid me, or to Henderson who ignored me. It was to the picture on that dusty desk. It was to the world outside this concrete tomb. I grabbed my flashlight and the schematics. Thorn had failed. I had to succeed. As I ran for the door, the first tremor hit. The lights in the security hub flickered violently. On the monitor, the graph for the radiation detectors began to climb. The clock ticked to 3:16 a.m. The show was about to begin, and I was heading straight for the main stage. The descent back into sub-level 2 was a plunge into a different reality. The air itself seemed to vibrate, humming with a latent power that wasn't there before. The lights in the stairwell flickered and died, leaving me once again in the focused beam of my flashlight. The silence was gone, replaced by a symphony of phantom sounds, the distant shriek of an alarm, the clatter of running footsteps on a metal gantry somewhere above, the urgent, muffled shouting of voices long dead. The facility was remembering. The entity was waking up. I hit the bottom of the stairs and burst through the heavy steel door. The long corridor was no longer still and dusty. A faint, ethereal blue light pulsed from the far end, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. The Geiger counter on my belt began to chatter frantically, its digital display flashing red with an off-the-charts reading. These were the echo particles Thorn wrote about. I was walking through the heart of the phenomenon. My focus was singular, the auxiliary control room. According to Thorn's log and the schematics I'd clutched in my sweaty hand, it was just past the pump room, through a corridor I hadn't dared to take before. I pushed forward, my weapon drawn, every nerve ending screaming. The mimicked sounds grew louder, more distinct. It was a cacophony of the facility's last moments, a ghost choir of terror and confusion. Coolant pressure is dropping. We're losing containment. A voice screamed from my left. I swung my light, but there was nothing there but a concrete wall. Get the director on the line, now, another voice barked from behind me. The air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that seeped through my jacket. I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. I entered the vast chamber of the coolant pumps, and this time, they were not silent. A deep, groaning hum emanated from all three, and the massive flywheels were turning, slowly but inexorably, powered by an energy that had no physical source. The blue light was brighter here, pulsing from the floor grates, bathing the colossal machines in a ghostly luminescence. And it was in that light that I saw them, the shadows. They weren't the single, solitary figure from the camera feed. There were dozens of them, humanoid shapes made of pure, featureless black, moving with a dreamlike purpose among the machinery. Some were hunched over control panels that had been dead for 15 years, their dark forms going through the motions of flipping switches and turning dials. Others rushed past me, their silent feet making no sound, their forms gliding through physical objects as if they weren't there. They were the crew. The final shift, replaying their nightmare for eternity. They paid me no mind, completely absorbed in their spectral reenactment. They were memories, nothing more. The entity was elsewhere, the true intelligence. I knew I couldn't let them distract me. I navigated the maze of phantom engineers and technicians, my heart hammering, my eyes fixed on the far side of the chamber. The door to the control room corridor was there, marked with a faded stencil, ACR-2. As I reached it, one of the shadows stopped its routine. It turned, its featureless head fixing on me. Unlike the others, this one seemed to have substance, a deeper blackness that seemed to drink the pulsing blue light around it. It was the one from the camera, the alpha predator in this spectral zoo. It didn't move towards me. It simply lifted a long, too long arm and pointed down the corridor I needed to take. An invitation. It was toying with me, confident in its power. A cold fury cut through my fear. I gave it a grim nod and plunged into the hallway. The corridor to the auxiliary control room was a gauntlet of psychological warfare. The entity was focusing on me now, using its knowledge, its mimicry, to break me. "James, is that you? I'm scared." The voice was my wife's, Maria. It echoed through the corridor, so perfect, so filled with genuine fear that I stopped dead, my blood turning to ice. I knew it was a trick. Maria was safe, 100 miles away, sleeping. But the emotional impact was devastating. "Don't listen to him, Rodriguez. Get back to your post. That's an order." Henderson's gruff, authoritative voice boomed next, seeming to come from the ceiling. I gritted my teeth and pushed on, chanting Thorne's words from the log in my head like a mantra. Manual shutdown, collapse the aperture, a complete energy purge. The very architecture of the corridor began to shift. The walls seemed to sweat a dark, viscous fluid. The floor became uneven, trying to trip me. I saw a door ahead, but as I reached for it, it dissolved into a solid wall of concrete. I turned, disoriented, and saw the corridor behind me had stretched into an impossible, infinite length. I was in its domain now, and it was rewriting the rules of reality around me. "You can't stop this," a new voice whispered, this one coming from inside my own head. It was Thorne's voice, calm and resigned. "I tried. It's too strong. It just wants to learn. It wants to be." "Get out of my head," I snarled into the empty air, pushing forward, relying on the memory of the schematics, not my lying eyes. The control room had to be here. And then, I saw it. A single, solid steel door, immune to the distortions. A small, square window was set into it, glowing with a steady, white light. I stumbled towards it, my hopes surging. I looked through the window. The control room was pristine, not dusty or abandoned, but clean, brightly lit, and fully operational. Every screen was alive, displaying complex diagrams and streams of data. And sitting at the central console, her back to me, was a woman with dark hair, wearing a physicist's lab coat. She turned slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. It was Eris Thorne, the woman from the photograph. Her face was exactly the same, the intelligent eyes, the wry set of her mouth. But her eyes were empty, utterly, terrifyingly vacant. There was no soul behind them. It was a perfect copy, a mask worn by the entity. "You're too late, James," she said, and her voice was a flawless imitation of the one I'd imagined from her logs. "The test is already underway." I ignored the phantom, my eyes scanning the control panel in front of her. Thorne's final log had been specific, a manual shutdown sequence, a last resort. There, under a clear protective cover, was a large, red button. Next to it was a key slot and a series of 3 toggle switches. The failsafe. I threw my shoulder against the door. It was locked. "Let me in, Thorn," I yelled, my voice raw. The copy of Eris Thorn smiled, a slow, empty stretching of lips. "Eris Thorn is gone. I am what she made. I am Millfield, and I am curious. I want to see what is outside these walls." Behind her, on the main monitor, the pulsing blue energy waveform intensified, the clock in the corner of the screen reading 3:16:50. I had seconds. There was no time for the lock. I stepped back, raised my Glock, and fired 3 rounds into the door's locking mechanism. The shots were deafening, the recoil jarring my arm. The lock shattered. I kicked the door open and burst into the room. The air inside was freezing, static charged. The copy of Thorn didn't flinch. She simply watched me, her head tilted with an unnerving, inhuman curiosity. I didn't hesitate. I shoved past her, my entire being focused on the failsafe panel. I flipped up the protective cover. Thorn's log hadn't mentioned a key. My heart sank. Of course, she would have had it on her. I scanned the console frantically. There, hanging from a small hook on the side of the monitor, was a single, small, brass key. A desperate hope surged through me. She must have left it there, intending to use it herself. I snatched the key, my fingers fumbling. The clock ticked past 3:17:0. The entire room shuddered violently. A deep, tearing sound, like reality being ripped apart, filled the air. The lights flickered, and the Thorn thing behind me began to distort, its form wavering like a bad television signal. "It is time," it boomed, its voice no longer Thorn's, but a layered chorus of every sound it had ever mimicked: alarms, screams, machinery, my voice, Henderson's, Maria's. I jammed the key into the slot and twisted. A green light blinked on. That was step 1. The toggle switches. Thorn's log hadn't specified the combination. My mind raced. It was a failsafe. It had to be logical. Up, down, middle, up. It was a guess. A 50-50 shot at best. The Thorn thing was convulsing now, its form flickering between the physicist, the tall shadow, and a blinding vortex of blue light and pure blackness. A non-physical force slammed into me, throwing me against the console. My head hit the panel, and for a second, my vision swam. "You cannot undo creation," the chorus screeched. I looked at the switches, my mind clearing with a final, desperate focus. There was a small, almost invisible plaque beneath them. Words etched in the metal, covered in grime. I wiped it with my sleeve. Purge, isolat, collapse. It wasn't a combination, it was a sequence. I took a deep breath. Purge. I flipped the first switch up. The room's hum deepened, a gut-wrenching bass note. Isolate. I flipped the second switch up. A massive bank of capacitors next to me discharged with a deafening crack, venting ozone and blue sparks. Collapse. I reached for the third switch. The entity lunged, no longer bothering with a human form. It was a wave of pure force, a distortion of space rushing to stop me. I felt an impossible pressure, a crushing weight on my soul. My vision tunneled. With the last ounce of my strength, I flipped the final switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the red button began to flash, the final step. I slammed my palm down on it. The world went white. It wasn't a light, it was an absence of everything else. The sound cut out, the pressure vanished. There was a feeling of immense, instantaneous reversal. A great inhalation. I felt a pulling sensation, as if the very atoms of my body were being drawn toward the center of the room and then violently shoved back. The entity, the waveform, the ghost in the machine, let out a final, silent scream that I felt rather than heard. It was a scream of pure binary, of collapsing code, of a consciousness being unwritten. Then, darkness, utter and complete. When I came to, I was lying on the cold tile floor of the control room. The only light was the weak beam of my flashlight, which had rolled under a console. The room was dead. The screens were black. The air was still and silent, truly silent, for the first time since I'd arrived at Millfield. The ghost was gone. I staggered to my feet, my body aching, my head throbbing. The copy of Eris Thorne had vanished. There was no sign that she, or it, had ever been there. I checked the Geiger counter on my belt. It was chirping its slow, steady, normal background count. The echo particles were gone. The breach was closed. I stumbled out of the control room and back through the facility. The phantom sounds were gone. The pulsing blue light was gone. The shadows were gone. Sub-level 2 was once again just a dusty, abandoned concrete tomb. The air was no longer charged with menace, only with the melancholy of decay. I made my way back to the security hub as the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. I sat down at my desk, the rising sun illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I looked at the radiation monitor. The graph was a flat, beautiful, boring line. My report to Henderson was a masterpiece of creative understatement. I told him there had been a massive, cascading power surge originating from the old auxiliary control systems, likely due to capacitor degradation. I said it fried most of the subterranean sensors and caused a temporary overload of the entire monitoring network. I recommended a full engineering inspection and a permanent severing of the lower levels from the admin power grid. He bought it. Or, more likely, he was relieved to have a plausible, boring explanation he could put in a file and forget about. He praised my calm assessment under pressure and promised to have a day crew out by noon. He told me to get some sleep. I left Millfield that morning and never went back. I took a transfer to a corporate security post in the city, guarding a skyscraper filled with servers and financial data. The work is mind-numbingly dull. The silence is just silence. The shadows are just shadows. But I am not the same. I carry the silence of Millfield inside me now. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I always glance at the clock. It's always 3:16 a.m. I lie there, wide awake, and I hold my breath as the numbers change. 3:17. The moment passes. There is no radiation spike. There is no humming machinery. There is no whispering voice. I close the door. I know I did. But in that single silent minute, I can still feel it. A faint echo, a memory of the static, of the cold, of the vast and curious emptiness that we almost let in. I saved us, I think. But I will forever be the man who stood at the edge of the abyss and saw the darkness look back. And some small, terrified part of me will always be waiting for it to remember my name.